Part 1, The Shocking Encounter ****. It all happened in a split second. The CEO, dressed as a common office worker, sat at a desk in the back corner of the bustling office floor. His eyes were glued to the screen, but his mind was focused on the events unfolding across the room. There, behind a towering desk, sat the manager, the one who had made the office a place of fear and discomfort for so many. As the employees nervously filed into the room, one of them, an exhausted-looking young man, approached the manager's desk. The manager, without even glancing up, raised a hand to silence him. The air thickened with tension, and the room grew eerily quiet. The manager's voice was cold, sharp as a blade. "You missed the deadline again," he snapped, his words cutting through the silence like a whip. The young man stood frozen, his eyes darting from the manager to his colleagues. It was clear he had made a mistake, but no one spoke up to defend him. "You're always late. What makes you think this company can afford mistakes like yours? Get out of my sight," the manager barked. The young man's face turned bright red as he quickly retreated, humiliated, his hands trembling. The CEO's grip tightened on his pen as his heart pounded in his chest. He had been in many business meetings, had dealt with countless challenges, but never had he felt such disgust. It wasn't just the manager's words, it was the sheer disregard for human dignity that sent a chill down his spine. He had heard rumors, whispers from employees about how the manager ruled with fear, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. His instincts screamed at him to stand up, to confront the manager and end the cycle of abuse right then and there. But the CEO knew better. This wasn't the time to act. Not yet. He needed to see more, understand the full extent of the manager's cruelty. He had to gather the evidence he needed. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, needed to be exposed. He watched, his pulse racing, as the manager called for another employee. This time, an older woman, whose face bore the lines of years spent under constant pressure. The manager gestured impatiently for her to come closer, and she did so with a hesitant step. The CEO could see the fear in her eyes, the way she shrunk under the manager's presence. "Did you fix the reports yet? I don't care if you were on the phone with a client or feeding your dog, this better be done," the manager sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The woman stammered, her face paling as she handed him the papers. He scanned them quickly, then tossed them back on her desk. "Pathetic," he muttered, and the woman quickly retreated, her head bowed. The CEO clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the man in charge. This was the man whose actions were shaping the very culture of the company. And this was the man he would expose, even if it meant risking everything. As the manager moved on to the next employee, the CEO's mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He couldn't let this continue. He had to gather the truth, piece it together like a puzzle, and take action, no matter the consequences. But for now, he would stay quiet, watch from the shadows, and learn everything he could. Because what he had just witnessed was only the beginning. The next morning, the CEO walked into the office under the guise of a new employee. Dressed in business casual, with a hat low enough to hide his face, he blended in with the crowd. He made his way to a nondescript desk in the corner, away from the manager's prying eyes. He could feel the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. This was the start of something big. No turning back now. His first day was filled with the typical office routine, meetings, phone calls, and small talk. But every moment, his mind was focused on his real objective. He wasn't here for the work, he was here to watch. He was here to witness firsthand the behavior of the manager that had been whispered about in the hallways, the kind of behavior that drove employees to quit or, worse, to stay in fear. The first few hours passed in a blur. The manager had been distant, shouting orders from his office, rarely stepping out into the main area. But as the day wore on, the CEO noticed something: the employees were on edge. They spoke in hushed tones, walking on eggshells as they passed each other. There was an unease in the air, like the calm before a storm. And all of it was directed toward one man, the manager. Around mid-afternoon, the CEO overheard a conversation between two colleagues in the break room. They were talking about the manager. One of them mentioned a past incident where an employee had been publicly humiliated for a minor mistake. Another employee had been reprimanded for asking a simple question. The manager's cruelty was a constant shadow hanging over everyone. It was no surprise that people whispered behind closed doors, but the CEO could see the real impact of this toxic atmosphere on the staff. "Why do we put up with him?" one of the employees asked, her voice barely audible. "Every day is like walking on glass." The other employee sighed, nodding in agreement. "He holds all the power. If you speak up, you're gone. I saw it happen to Dave last month. He tried to report the manager for his behavior, and look where he is now, fired with no explanation." The CEO's heart sank. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fear, the silence, the helplessness, it was all too real. It was worse than he had imagined. As the conversation ended and the employees returned to their desks, the CEO's mind was set. This was no longer just about exposing a bad manager, it was about saving the company, about restoring dignity to the employees who had been crushed under his reign. The more he observed, the more he realized how deep the problem ran. The manager wasn't just a tyrant, he was a symptom of a much larger issue, an issue that the CEO had to address, one way or another. But there was no rush. He couldn't act recklessly. This was a game of patience, of precision. He had to gather more evidence, learn more about the manager's tactics, and find the right moment to strike. The CEO spent the next few days in the office, continuing his undercover role. Every interaction with the manager left him disgusted, but it also solidified his resolve. He was in too deep now to turn back. Soon, it would all come to a head, and when it did, the manager's world would come crashing down. But for now, the CEO bided his time. He stayed silent, observing, gathering everything he needed. This was just the beginning. And when the moment came, the manager wouldn't know what hit him. Days passed, and the CEO settled deeper into his undercover role, watching and listening, observing every move the manager made. He noticed the same pattern day after day: intimidation, manipulation, and, above all, a relentless need to assert power. It was as though the manager thrived on the discomfort of others, relishing in the fear he instilled. The CEO had seen glimpses of this kind of behavior in the past, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. Employees weren't just afraid of the manager, they were terrified. He bullied those who spoke out, humiliated those who didn't meet his expectations, and rewarded those who played along with his toxic ways. There was one instance that stuck in the CEO's mind, a moment that spoke volumes about the manager's character. One afternoon, a young woman, a new hire, was summoned into the manager's office. The CEO watched from the doorway as she nervously stepped inside. From what he could overhear, it seemed that she had made a small mistake in her report. It wasn't a major error, just a minor oversight that could have been easily corrected with a quick conversation. But instead, the manager exploded. His voice rose in fury, and the young woman was visibly shaken. She tried to explain herself, but her words only made him angrier. The CEO's stomach churned as he heard the manager berate her, calling her incompetent and useless in front of the entire team. The woman's face turned crimson, her eyes filled with humiliation. She barely muttered an apology before scurrying out of the office, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The CEO knew he couldn't let this go on. The damage the manager was doing wasn't just to the employees, it was to the very heart of the company itself. This kind of toxic leadership bred fear, not respect, and it was destroying the morale of the team. That evening, as the office began to empty out, the CEO found himself alone with one of the senior employees in the break room. He had struck up a conversation with her earlier that week, trying to get a feel for the general atmosphere of the office without drawing attention to himself. Over the course of their chats, she had begun to open up to him, sharing some of her experiences and frustrations with the manager. "I've seen people come and go because of him," she confessed quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "He has a way of making you feel small, insignificant. I'm not sure how much longer I can take it." The CEO leaned in slightly, his voice calm and reassuring. "But why does everyone put up with it? Why don't they say something?" The woman sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. "Because we're all afraid. We're afraid of losing our jobs, of being blacklisted. The manager has his connections, and he's made it clear that if you speak out, you'll be punished." She paused for a moment, glancing down at her hands. "And the worst part? Some of us even believe it. We start thinking we don't deserve better. That we deserve to be treated this way." Her words hit the CEO hard. He had always known that fear and power could be a dangerous combination, but seeing it up close, hearing it from someone who had been living it, made everything feel more real. It wasn't just the manager who was the problem, it was the culture he had created, one where fear was the driving force behind everything. The CEO took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He wasn't here just to expose the manager, he was here to expose the culture that had allowed this behavior to flourish. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for the fight. He couldn't let this continue any longer. The next few days were a blur of tension and calculation. The CEO had collected enough evidence to show the manager's true colors, but he needed more. He needed to understand the full scope of the damage and find a way to fix it without causing chaos. The employees had suffered enough, they needed someone to stand up for them. And that someone was going to be him. The manager may have ruled with fear, but the CEO was about to show him what true leadership meant. The clock was ticking, and the time to act was drawing near. The CEO's patience was starting to wear thin. The more he observed the manager's behavior, the more he realized the depths of the toxic environment he had fostered. Every day, employees walked around like ghosts, silent, withdrawn, their eyes constantly on the lookout for any sign of the manager's wrath. No one was safe, and no mistake was too small to escape punishment. One morning, the CEO overheard another confrontation, this time between the manager and an older employee. The man was in his 50s, his face lined with years of hard work, and he was known for his dedication. Yet, the manager treated him as though he were a mere nuisance. The older man had simply asked for clarification on a project, and the manager's response was nothing short of cruel. "You can't even understand a simple task, can you? Maybe you should retire. You're too old to keep up with this pace," the manager sneered. The CEO felt the anger rise in his chest, but he remained seated, invisible in the corner. The older man's face reddened, but he didn't respond. He simply nodded, then hurried away, his shoulders hunched with embarrassment. As the CEO watched this exchange, a part of him began to feel like he had seen enough. He knew he had to act soon, but there were so many variables to consider. Exposing the manager wasn't going to be a simple task, it would ripple through the entire company. Some employees would be grateful, but others might be angry, even fearful of the changes that were about to unfold. But what choice did he have? The longer he waited, the worse it would get for the employees. The manager's actions were eroding the very fabric of the company. No one was truly thriving under his rule. The CEO needed to strike a delicate balance between taking action and not creating a storm too big to handle. However, there was another concern. The CEO couldn't ignore the possibility that some employees, out of fear or loyalty, might choose to stand by the manager. It was easy to assume everyone was as unhappy as the ones who confided in him, but the reality might be more complicated. Some might even find themselves caught in the crossfire, unsure which side to take. The CEO weighed his options carefully. He could expose the manager immediately, causing a sudden upheaval, but that might alienate certain employees who were too afraid to speak out. On the other hand, if he waited too long, he risked allowing the situation to worsen, and that would be a betrayal of the trust the employees had placed in him. The timing was critical. But as the days went on, the situation became clearer. The more he observed, the more he understood the true extent of the manager's control. This wasn't just about one man's cruelty, it was about the culture that had been allowed to grow unchecked. If the CEO wanted to fix the company, he had to expose this culture for what it truly was. One afternoon, the CEO made up his mind. He had gathered all the evidence he needed, and the time to act was now. He couldn't wait any longer. He was going to confront the manager directly, no more hiding in the shadows. He had seen enough, and it was time to bring everything into the light. But as he prepared for his confrontation, doubts began to creep into his mind. What would happen next? Would the employees rally behind him, or would they retreat into their shells, afraid of the fallout? And what about the manager? Would he retaliate, using his power to protect himself and destroy the CEO's credibility? The tension was building, and the CEO knew that when the moment came, everything would change. This was a battle for more than just the future of the manager, it was about the future of the company, the well-being of the employees, and the kind of leadership that would define the organization moving forward. The decision he was about to make would ripple through the company, and no one could predict where it would lead. Would his actions lead to a positive transformation, or would it all fall apart in a blaze of conflict? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the CEO couldn't turn back now. The stakes were too high, and the need for change was too great. The CEO's decision had been made. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but there was no turning back. The time for passive observation was over. The situation had reached a breaking point. Employees were walking around with their heads down, their spirits crushed, and the manager's cruelty was becoming unbearable. The CEO knew that something had to give, and it had to be now. One fateful morning, the CEO overheard another conversation that pushed him past the point of no return. As he walked down the hall toward the break room, he could hear raised voices from the manager's office. He paused for a moment, unsure whether to eavesdrop, but something told him he needed to know what was happening. It was a confrontation, this time between the manager and one of the longtime employees, a woman who had been with the company for years. She was known for her efficiency, but that didn't seem to matter to the manager. The CEO listened in as the manager's angry voice echoed through the hallway. "I can't believe you haven't finished the project yet. You're pathetic. What do you even do all day?" The words were harsh, cutting into the woman like daggers. She stammered, explaining that she had encountered unforeseen complications, but the manager didn't care. "Excuses," he roared. "You're wasting my time. I should have fired you years ago." The woman's eyes welled up with tears, but she stood her ground. "I've been working here for years. I've given my best every day. This isn't right." The CEO could feel the frustration building inside him. He had seen enough. The toxic atmosphere was no longer just a workplace issue, it was a moral issue. The manager was destroying lives, one employee at a time. And for what? Power? Control? It wasn't worth it. The company was losing its soul, and the CEO couldn't allow that to happen any longer. As the woman left the office, her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face, the CEO made his move. He called a meeting. The employees gathered in the conference room, unsure of what was about to unfold. Many of them had seen him around but didn't know who he really was. The CEO stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know that many of you are unhappy," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I know that the environment here has become toxic, and I'm not going to pretend I don't see it. It's time for a change, and that change starts now. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, tense. The employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should trust him or not. The manager you've been working under has created a culture of fear. This is not the kind of workplace I want for any of you. And it's not the kind of leadership I want to promote. He felt the weight of those words settle over him, knowing that the moment he spoke them, everything would shift. The time has come for me to expose the truth. Gasps filled the room. Some employees looked shocked, others confused. But none of them expected what came next. The CEO revealed his true identity. "I am the CEO of this company," he said, his voice steady. "I've been here undercover for the last few weeks, watching and listening. And what I've witnessed has been nothing short of appalling." The room was silent. The CEO could see the disbelief on their faces, but he didn't give them time to react. He continued. "The manager has been using fear and intimidation to control everyone here. And I will not stand for it any longer. The time for silence is over." He paused again, letting the gravity of his words settle in. The manager would be exposed. The truth would finally come out. And there was no going back. As the employees processed the information, the CEO could feel the energy in the room shift. Some looked relieved, others were still processing, but all of them were on edge. They had witnessed the cruelty, but now they had to face the consequences of speaking out. What would the manager do when he found out? Would he retaliate? And what would the fallout be for the company? The CEO wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he had made the right choice. The time to take action had arrived, and there was no turning back. The manager had underestimated the power of truth. And now, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The CEO had exposed his true identity to the staff, and the tension in the office had escalated to a level the manager had never anticipated. Word spread quickly that the CEO had been undercover for weeks, observing everything. The employees who had been living in fear began to whisper to each other, some with looks of hope, others with uncertainty. Would the manager be removed from his position? Would things actually change? Meanwhile, the CEO had called for an emergency meeting with the board of directors, the senior staff, and, most importantly, the manager. The stage was set, and he knew it was time to face the man who had been running the company with an iron fist. The CEO sat in the boardroom, flanked by senior employees, while the manager sat across the table, unaware of what was coming. His usual smug expression was absent today. The CEO could see the nerves just beneath the surface. The man had always been confident in his power, but now that power was slipping away. As the meeting began, the CEO took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving the manager. "We have a problem," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "For the past few weeks, I've been working here undercover. I've seen how you treat the employees, how you humiliate them, belittle them, and manipulate them into living in fear. I've seen enough to know that this cannot continue." The room went silent. The manager's face drained of color as realization hit him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the CEO raised a hand, signaling for him to remain silent. "You've allowed this toxic culture to permeate every level of the company," the CEO continued. "You've abused your position, used fear as a weapon, and done irreparable harm to this organization. But most of all, you've broken the trust of every single person who works here." The manager's eyes narrowed, but the CEO could see that the fight was draining out of him. He had no power here. Not anymore. "We cannot move forward while you remain in charge. You have created a division among the employees that cannot be healed with you at the helm," the CEO declared. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position." The manager's face twisted with anger, but there was nothing he could do. The CEO had already made the decision. The room, which had been tense and uncertain just moments before, now buzzed with quiet relief. Some employees exchanged glances, others simply sat back, watching the fallout unfold. But the manager wasn't done. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back with force. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "You have no idea what you're doing. You'll regret this. You have no idea what you've unleashed." The CEO remained calm. "No, it's you who has no idea what you've unleashed. You've created a toxic environment, and I am ending it now. Your time here is over." The manager, still seething, turned to leave, but not before casting one last, venomous glare around the room. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving behind a quiet office full of employees who had been living under the shadow of his tyranny. The CEO let out a slow breath. The first step had been taken. The manager was gone, but the real work was just beginning. The company would need healing, restructuring, and a new vision. But for the first time in a long time, the employees felt something they hadn't in years: hope. The culture of fear was gone, replaced by the possibility of a new, more supportive future. The CEO knew that this would not be an easy journey, but it was the only way forward. As the staff filed out of the boardroom, many of them approached the CEO with quiet gratitude, offering a word of thanks or a nod of acknowledgement. It was a small but significant gesture. They had been seen. They had been heard. The CEO watched them go, a feeling of both satisfaction and determination filling him. The road ahead would be challenging, but he knew it was the right one. The company would rebuild, stronger and better than before. And, most importantly, it would never again be ruled by fear. The days after the manager's departure were filled with a mix of relief, uncertainty, and cautious optimism. The CEO had done what he needed to do, but the real work had just begun. With the manager out of the picture, the company had an opportunity to rebuild itself, but it wasn't going to be easy. There were deep scars left by the toxic culture that had taken root under the manager's rule, and those scars would take time to heal. The employees, many of whom had lived in constant fear, now found themselves in an environment where they could breathe again. The atmosphere at work had changed almost overnight. People who once walked on eggshells now walked with their heads held high. They spoke freely, no longer afraid of being humiliated or belittled for every little mistake. But despite the change, the CEO knew it would take time for the wounds to fully heal. In the first few weeks after the manager's termination, there were numerous meetings with employees, one-on-one discussions, and team-building exercises. The CEO wanted to make sure that everyone felt heard, understood, and supported as they adjusted to the new environment. He knew that the shift from a fear-based workplace to one based on respect and collaboration wouldn't be instantaneous. It would take consistent effort from everyone, but most importantly, it would take the right kind of leadership. One afternoon, as the CEO walked through the office, he noticed a group of employees gathered in the break room, speaking in hushed tones. When they saw him, they fell silent, almost instinctively, as if the old habit of fear was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. The CEO paused, his gaze softening. "Don't worry, you can speak freely," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "The old days are behind us." One of the employees, a middle-aged man who had been with the company for over 20 years, stepped forward. His face was weathered, but his eyes were full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've no idea what it's been like to work here. It's been years since I've been able to speak my mind without feeling like I'd lose my job." The CEO nodded. "I understand. And that's why we're here now, to rebuild this company on trust, respect, and understanding. We're going to make this place a place where everyone can thrive, not just survive." The man smiled, a glimmer of hope finally appearing in his eyes. "I believe you," he said, the word simple but carrying more weight than the CEO could fully appreciate. Over the next few weeks, the CEO made sure to stay visible and involved. He walked the floors, greeted employees, and continued to have one-on-one conversations with as many people as possible. He made it clear that the company was shifting toward a new way of doing things, where kindness, hard work, and collaboration were valued above all else. But there were challenges ahead. Some employees, who had grown comfortable with the fear-driven culture, struggled to adapt to the changes. They weren't used to a workplace where they were encouraged to speak up, share ideas, or even make mistakes. Some took longer than others to embrace the new atmosphere, still wary of the potential consequences of being too open. The CEO knew it would take time for everyone to feel fully comfortable in this new environment. But he also knew that change, even when it was for the better, could be difficult. And that was okay. The important thing was that they were moving in the right direction. One of the biggest hurdles came when the CEO decided to implement a feedback system, encouraging employees to voice their concerns and suggestions anonymously. The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some employees were thrilled by the opportunity to have their voices heard without fear of retaliation. Others, however, hesitated. They weren't sure if the system would truly be anonymous, or if it was just another way for management to keep tabs on them. The CEO knew that trust would need to be built over time. The feedback system was only a small part of the overall effort to create a healthier, more transparent workplace, but it was an important step. He assured the employees that their feedback would be taken seriously, and that they would be part of the process of shaping the future of the company. Slowly, the employees began to open up. The feedback started flowing in, some positive, some critical, but all valuable. The CEO reviewed each submission carefully, making adjustments where needed and keeping the lines of communication open. Through all the ups and downs, the CEO remained committed to his vision. He was no longer just an observer, he was the leader of this company, and it was his responsibility to guide it through the recovery process. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that the company was worth saving. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation was undeniable. The employees felt empowered, engaged, and, most importantly, respected. The toxic culture that had once been so ingrained was slowly being replaced by a new culture, one built on mutual trust, understanding, and support. The CEO took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The journey had been difficult, filled with challenges and difficult decisions, but it had also been one of growth and redemption. And while there was still much work to be done, he knew that the company was on the right path. The CEO looked around the office, at the employees who were now thriving in an environment where they were no longer afraid. He knew that this wasn't just about exposing one bad manager, it was about creating a new future, one where everyone could flourish. And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. The journey was far from over, but the company had taken its first steps toward becoming something better, something stronger. And that, to the CEO, was worth everything. Months passed, and the transformation the CEO had hoped for began to materialize. The office, once tense and filled with fear, had become a place of collaboration, creativity, and respect. Employees no longer felt the need to look over their shoulders, constantly afraid of making a mistake. Instead, they were encouraged to share their ideas, ask questions, and offer suggestions, knowing their voices would be heard. The CEO had kept his promise. He had rebuilt the company's culture, piece by piece, with every decision he made, every action he took. It was no longer just about eliminating the toxic environment that the previous manager had cultivated, it was about creating something new. Something better. But rebuilding was never a simple task. There were still growing pains, moments when employees stumbled, uncertain of how to navigate the new expectations. There were times when trust was tested, and the CEO had to remind himself that change didn't happen overnight. He understood the depth of the damage caused by the manager's reign, and he knew that healing would take time. One afternoon, the CEO met with the leadership team to discuss their progress. As they sat around the table, he noticed a different energy in the room, one of optimism, of possibility. It was a far cry from the fearful silence that had defined the old leadership meetings. They had become a team, not just employees working under his direction, but a group of people invested in the company's success. "We've made a lot of progress," one of the senior leaders said, a hint of pride in her voice. "But there's still work to be done. People are still adjusting to this new way of thinking. Some of them are still uncertain about what's expected of them." The CEO nodded thoughtfully. "I know. Change is difficult, especially after years of fear and oppression. But we've laid the foundation. We've shown them that things can be different. Now it's about consistency. We need to keep reinforcing the values we've put in place: respect, transparency, collaboration." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each leader. "But we also need to be patient. Not everyone will embrace these changes immediately, and that's okay. What matters is that we keep moving forward, together." As the meeting ended, the CEO felt a sense of pride. The company was no longer just a place where employees came to work, it had become a place where they could grow, thrive, and feel valued. The toxic atmosphere that had once overshadowed everything was gone, replaced by a sense of community and purpose. But just as things seemed to be settling into a new rhythm, the CEO received an unexpected visit. It was from the former manager. His face was hard, his eyes filled with resentment as he stood in the CEO's office. "I should have seen it coming," the manager spat, his tone bitter. "You've ruined everything. You think you've made things better? You've just created a weak, ineffective company. You'll see. This place will fall apart without someone like me." The CEO stood, his expression calm but firm. "You had your chance," he said quietly. "You had the opportunity to lead with integrity, to build a company that people wanted to be a part of. But instead, you chose fear. And fear doesn't build anything lasting." The former manager scoffed, shaking his head. "You're a fool if you think this company can thrive without someone like me. You'll regret this decision." The CEO didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew that this conversation was pointless. The damage had already been done, but the company was no longer in the hands of someone who thrived on fear and control. It was in the hands of a team committed to change, growth, and respect. As the manager turned and left, the CEO felt a quiet sense of relief. The former manager's threats no longer had any weight. The company had moved on. The transformation was real, and it was unstoppable. In the weeks that followed, the CEO continued to lead with the same vision that had guided him from the beginning. He met with employees regularly, reinforcing the values that had become the backbone of the company. He listened to their concerns, celebrated their successes, and encouraged them to continue pushing for excellence. But most importantly, he had created a culture where people felt valued, not just as workers, but as individuals with their own dreams, goals, and ideas. The workplace was no longer a place of fear, but a place of possibility. The manager, once so powerful and controlling, had faded into the past, his influence completely erased. The company was thriving in ways the CEO had only hoped for in the beginning. And as he looked around at the employees who were now fully invested in the company's future, he knew that the real work had been done. They had all grown together. The company had gone from a place of fear to a place of opportunity. And for the CEO, that was the greatest success of all. But as he sat at his desk one evening, looking out over the office filled with hard-working, motivated employees, he knew there was one last lesson to be learned. Leadership wasn't just about making the hard decisions, it was about empowering others to make their own. It was about giving people the tools and the trust they needed to grow and succeed. The journey wasn't over. It would never be. But the CEO knew they were on the right path. And that, he thought, was all that mattered. As the months rolled on, the company continued to evolve in ways the CEO had never imagined possible. The changes he had made, though difficult at first, had taken root, and now the company was more than just a business. It had become a community, a family of individuals who were dedicated to working together toward a common goal. But as the CEO stood in his office one quiet evening, reflecting on the journey, he realized that the greatest lesson he had learned wasn't just about leadership or corporate success, it was about the power of redemption and second chances. He thought back to the days when the office was filled with fear, when the manager's oppressive rule cast a dark shadow over everyone. He remembered the faces of employees who had once walked around like ghosts, afraid to speak up, afraid to make a mistake. It was hard to believe that the same people, who had once been broken by the toxic environment, were now thriving, filled with hope, confidence, and determination. The CEO knew that none of this would have been possible if he had not taken that bold step to confront the problem head-on. But it hadn't been just about firing the manager. It had been about understanding that true leadership meant more than making tough decisions. It was about giving people the chance to rise above their circumstances, to grow and develop into the best versions of themselves. The CEO had made mistakes in the past, both in business and in life. But one thing he had never doubted was his commitment to doing what was right. He had learned that the greatest leaders weren't the ones who wielded power to control others, but the ones who empowered others to be their best. One day, a young employee came into the CEO's office, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had been with the company for a short time but had quickly risen through the ranks due to her dedication and innovative ideas. She had once been one of the employees living in fear, unsure of her worth, uncertain of her future. "Thank you," she said quietly, standing before him. "I don't think I'd be where I am today without the changes you've made. I finally feel like I belong here." The CEO smiled, nodding slowly. "You've earned your place here, just like everyone else. You've earned the right to be heard, to share your ideas, and to grow. And that's what this company is about now, creating a place where everyone can thrive, regardless of where they started." He watched her leave his office, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It wasn't just the success of the company he was proud of, it was the transformation of the people who worked there. He had given them the space to find their voices, and they had taken that opportunity to prove what they were capable of. The CEO knew that the journey of transformation was never truly over. Every day was a new opportunity to learn, to grow, and to lead with compassion and integrity. The company would continue to face challenges, but now they had the strength, the unity, and the courage to overcome them together. And as the CEO looked back on everything they had accomplished, he realized that the greatest lesson he had learned wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about understanding the potential in people, and believing in their ability to change and grow, even when they didn't believe in themselves. In the end, it was this belief in others that had transformed not only the company but also him as a leader. He had learned that leadership was not about making decisions from a position of power, it was about lifting others up, trusting them with responsibility, and giving them the opportunity to shine. The story of this company, of its redemption, was proof that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always a way forward. It wasn't the mistakes or the failures that defined them, but the willingness to learn, to forgive, and to strive for something better. And with that, the CEO knew that the company was not just surviving, it was living, growing, and thriving. And so was he. The end of one journey was merely the beginning of another.